To use the Angular HTTP service, just to bring this back in memory, I want to use it here to save and fetch recipes in the end. So to use that, we need a place to make these HTTP requests. Now, the buttons I just showed you can be found in the header. So there, indeed, if we have a look at our project, we have that header component. Here we have the save data and the fetch data buttons, and there's our header component. Now, of course, one thing we could do is we could add click listeners to these buttons, and then in the component body of the header component, we could inject the Angular HTTP service and make our HTTP requests here. Now, this has a couple of disadvantages. One disadvantage is that here in the header component, we have the buttons, but we don't really have the data we want to interact with. The data we want to interact with are our recipes, of course, and these are managed in the recipe service. Therefore, a better place to make these requests would be the recipe service. Though I'll take yet another route here, which is optional though. I will create a new service for this in the shared folder, and I will name this data-storage service. And that is totally optional. You could definitely manage this in the recipe service. I just want to split this up to make it really easy to focus on that HTTP functionality and for you to quickly find it if you later go through that project again. But handling the HTTP requests in the recipe service would be perfectly fine because we are interacting with recipes in the end. Yet here is the data storage service, and there let's export a class which should be named data storage service to use that typical naming pattern. And we can again provide this. We have to provide this. Now, first of all, we will inject the Angular HTTP service. And since we will inject a service into a service, we need to add injectable. You learned this in the services section, and it is important to keep this in mind. Theoretically, add injectable is optional. You don't need to add it to your services. But you need to add it as soon as your service gets another service injected, which will be the case here because I will inject the HTTP service. And in addition to that, here we can now also use that newer shortcut of providing this, the alternative to adding it to the provider's array in the app module. We can simply add an object which we pass as an argument to add injectable, where we set provided into root. Now again, as you learned, this is optional. You could not use that and instead add the data storage service here to providers, just as we're doing it with the shopping list service and the recipe service. And on the other hand, you could of course also provide these services in the same way we're providing this data storage service now. Now with that, I already mentioned it, we definitely should inject something into that data storage service, and that something will be the Angular HTTP client. Now, as you learned in that HTTP module, for that to be usable, we first of all need to do something in the app module. There, we need to import the HTTP client module from @Angular common HTTP. So this import statement needs to be added at the top of the app module. And with that added, we have to import that HTTP client module. So now down there in the imports array of our ng module, here maybe after the reactive forms module, because I like to group all the Angular modules together before our custom modules come. So here we can now add that HTTP client module, and this is crucial to unlock the HTTP client functionality in our application. With that, in any part of our application, we can use the Angular HTTP client, which means we can inject it. And that's the next step. Here in the data storage service, I want to send HTTP requests, and I will do that, or we will do that, by using the Angular HTTP client. Now with the HTTP client module imported into our project, we can inject the Angular HTTP client here. For that, we first of all need to import it. Now here it's named HTTP client, and we import it from @Angular/common/HTTP. Now, I will store it in a private property named HTTP, and again, this is this TypeScript shortcut where by adding an accessor, like private, in front of the argument, TypeScript automatically creates a property of the same name and stores whatever we accept as an argument here in that property. And for Angular's dependency injection to work, we now have to set the type here of that injected argument to HTTP client, so what I imported here. Now Angular is able to inject this, also thanks to us unlocking the HTTP client in the app module. And now we can start writing logic to save recipes to our backend and to fetch them from there. Now, I guess it makes sense to start with saving recipes because it's hard to fetch them if we never save them. And for that, I will add a new method here to the data storage service, which I'll name store recipes. Now, of course, you can name this method however you want. And now here we got two possible routes we could take. We could accept the recipes we want to store here as an argument by injecting by importing our recipe model up here and then defining that this should be of type recipe array. And then here we could just write the HTTP request where we want to, well, store these recipes on the backend by sending some meaningful request to some URL. Now we could do that. We could also inject the recipes service into our data storage service. That would be the other way. And then we could directly get our currently loaded recipes from that recipe service and we avoid this extra argument. And that is what I will do indeed. So I will inject another service here, the recipes service, which is of type recipe service. Let's name it recipe service here too. You need to add that import to the recipe service, of course. And now with that injected, I get my recipes by reaching out to this recipe service and by simply getting the recipes with get recipes. So this retrieves our list of recipes, which are now temporarily stored in that constant. Therefore, we can remove that model import up there. We don't need that because we're not using the type. And now with the recipes loaded here in store recipes, we can make our HTTP request. So here we can now use the Angular HTTP client. And now we could definitely make a post request if we would want to add one recipe, but I want to store all my recipes. And I essentially want to overwrite any previous recipes I stored. And for that, Firebase gives us an endpoint which we read by using a put request. And again, that strongly depends on the API you're using on the backend. Here, Firebase works such that we can send a put request to a specific URL to overwrite all the data that is stored under that node. Your backend might work differently. If you're creating your own backend, it might be working differently. It's always depending on the API you're working with. But Firebase works such that if we send a put request to a URL, any data that's in there will be overwritten. So let me copy that here, that URL. Let's add it here. That's the URL I want to send this to, though that's not the entire URL. Instead, it should be sent to /recipes.json. The .json is a Firebase characteristic. You need to add this at the end of the URL. It has nothing to do with the data you're sending or with Angular. And, well, /recipes, that's just how the Firebase real-time database works. It gives us a REST API where we in the end define our own nodes, which will then be translated to folders, you could say, where the data will be stored in. So now we're sending a put request there, but a put request, just like a post request, needs data to work. We need to tell Angular what to put on this URL, so to say, or what to attach to this request. And that will be our recipes here, of course. I guess that makes sense. Now, as you learned, this alone will not send the HTTP request. Instead, that request will only be sent as soon as we subscribe. Now, we got two routes we could take here. We can return our observable here by adding the return keyword, and then we can subscribe in the component where we're calling store recipes. Now, in our case here, that will be the header component because that is where our buttons are. And in the end, I'm not interested in subscribing in that component because I don't want to show a loading spinner, though of course you could do that, but here I just don't want to. And therefore, there is no need for me to subscribe in the component, because the component in this scenario will not be interested in whether that request is done or not. If that's different in your application, obviously you can use the pattern I also showed you in the last section, where you do subscribe in the component that triggered that request or that method. So here instead I will subscribe directly in the service because I have no interest in the response in my component. And I will get back a response here. And we can console log that to have a look at it. I will not do much else with it though here. Now with that, we just need to make sure that the store recipes method is getting called. And as I mentioned, that will happen from inside the header component. There we have that save data button. Let's add a click listener here and maybe call on save data or whatever you want to call that method here. And then let's add that method to the header component. And in here, we now have to call our newly added save recipes method in this data storage service. And for that, of course, we need to inject our data storage service here by using its type. Make sure you import that type from your file, from your data storage service file in the shared folder. And now with it injected, in onSaveData, we can use the data storage service and call store recipes. And that should already be all. Now let's go back to our application, which should have reloaded, and let's click Manage, Save Data. Here I'm getting back a response. That looks promising. So basically Firebase in this case returns the data we did store. More interesting, let's have a look at Firebase. And there indeed we see a new recipes node. And in there we have these recipes. Now, if you watched the previous module, which you absolutely should, you saw that there Firebase created some cryptic keys for these recipes. It always does it when you post data, when you attach one data piece at a time. If you put data, it assumes that you know what you're putting there. And therefore, if you wanted IDs here for these recipes, you would have to generate and add them on your own. But here, I'm fine with the normal array indexes here, which I have, which will be all we need. That is looking good. Our data is getting stored, including the ingredients, as you can tell. And with that, we finished the part where we store data. Now let's make sure we can also fetch data.